Hi everybody, you're listening to Comics and History, episode number 124, part 8, concluding our spotlight on the Spectre during the John Ostrander-Tom Mandrake run. And welcome to the show. I am your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back in session as we look at the final issue of the John Ostrander-Tom Mandrake run on the Spectre. I had a feeling that we'd need a part 8, and this most likely won't be a full-length episode, but it is important to take the time to look at the events which unfold in the last issue of the John Ostrander-Tom Mandrake run on the Spectre. So in the penultimate issue, Jim Corrigan confronts his perception of God. He makes amends with his father. He's able to forgive his father for all of the pain and torment that he suffered during his formative years. And now, back at the home of his spiritual advisor, Father Richard Kramer, Jim Corrigan is tired. And his words serve as a perfect bookend to how he saw Jim Corrigan in the first issue of this magnificent run. As Jim says, "Padre, I'm so tired. I just want it to end. What do I have to do?" And Father Kramer smiles, looks at Jim in the eye, and says, "Jim, have you ever had a funeral?" And Jim says, "Well, no. I spent so long trying to convince people that I was still alive." And Father Kramer says, "Well, Jim, I think it's time for you to have a funeral." They say a funeral provides closure for those who are in mourning, but I think in your case, a funeral is what you need. I'm going to make a few calls, and we're going to send you home in the morning. And the penultimate issue ends with the text box simply reading, "To be concluded." And in the letters column, Associate Editor Peter Tomasi explains to the readers that issue number 62 will indeed be the final issue of Volume 3 of the Spectre. And Tomasi explains that the series is not ending due to poor sales, it's not ending due to a lack of faith on editorial's part and what Ostrander and Mandrake were doing. It was simply that Ostrander and Mandrake had been working towards bringing a perfectly logical conclusion to Jim Corrigan's time as the Spectre, and editorial was in complete agreement with the creative team on the direction which they were taking. And so out of pure respect for all that Ostrander, Mandrake and company had done, the decision was made to end Volume 3 with the 62nd issue. And what an issue it is. It opens with the Spectre and Corrigan united in the guise of the Spectre, but still having a back and forth dialogue. We can see their distinct word bubbles showing the conversation going on between the two of them. Ostrander has this really neat visual effect wherein in some panels we see Jim Corrigan's face under the Spectre's hood, while in other panels it's the Spectre's face that we see under the hood. And one can imagine that Jim is pretty nervous about this. He isn't sure that he's going to get what he wants, i.e. his eternal rest in heaven. And he asks the Spectre what will happen after he dies. And the Spectre is quite short in his responses to Corrigan in this dialogue. And he explains that Jim will move on and the Spectre will be reassigned to a new host. And Jim asks if the Spectre will remember any of this time that they have spent together. And the Spectre responds, no, he does not remember any of his previous hosts. And the Spectre is being honest here. I mean, that was established back in the Zero issue. But it's a case of the Spectre being brutally honest here. And I'm sure that this is concerning to Jim, to say the least. I mean, Jim has been the host of the Spectre for over 50 years now. And given all that he and the Spectre have been through, in this run by Ostrander-Mandrake on its own, it must be disheartening to Corrigan to think that in the end he'll have had no real lasting impact on the Spectre. Or perhaps he will. I would like to think that Corrigan hopes that the Spectre may not remember Jim Corrigan by name, but he may remember having a host who said certain words or took certain actions to try to influence the Spectre's approach or to change him for the better. In any event, the scene shifts to Father Kramer's home, and Kramer's on the line with somebody else, and he explains to the person on the other end of the line that he's made arrangements for a small service for Corrigan the next morning. He secured a small plot of land in the cemetery. There's an unmarked tombstone, and there'll be a short service, and then hopefully that will be it. And it turns out that the other person on the other end of the line is Nate Kane, and Nate shares the whereabouts of Jim's physical remains. They're in the cold case files in the evidence locker at police headquarters. And so Father Kramer is going to relay that information to the Spectre so that he can go and get the remains, because that's very important for the Spectre. In order for this funeral to feel real, in order for it to take place, Jim's human remains must be buried. And so the conversation ends, and the scene shifts to Nate's home, and we see that Alex is there. So clearly they've decided to stay in touch, and from their conversation, it appears that they're growing closer to each other. And Nate explains to Alex that he needs to go to the funeral. Jim Corrigan is his partner, and he owes it to him. And Alex says, well, Nate, I'm going to go with you. And Nate says, but why? He tried to judge you. He tried to kill you. And Alex says, I'm not going for Jim, Nate. I'm going for you. I just love the character of Alex and the way she is portrayed. Just a wonderful companion for Nate. And just speaks to the power of what Ostrander-Mandrake were doing, that even in the last few issues, they introduced such a wonderful character. Now, I do need to have a little aside here, and just remind all of you that during the Fleischer-Aparo run on the Spectre in Adventure Comics in the first half of the Bronze Age, Jim Corrigan did get his humanity back. He died shortly thereafter, and he was given a funeral. But I get the impression that that did not happen in the post-crisis timeline. In fact, when I think back on this entire run by Ostrander-Mandrake, I really get the feeling that they looked at the Fleischer-Aparo run and said, that's something which really stands on its own. So we're not going to dismiss it, but we're not going to try to weave it in to the post-crisis reality. We're going to leave it untouched. Simply because, while there are some neat visual references to the run, provided by Mandrake, we never see the characters of Gwen Sterling or Earl Crawford. Unless I missed something, they were never mentioned once in the Ostrander-Mandrake run. I think they did that purely out of respect, just so that they wouldn't have to take any of that short-lived run and tweak it, which I think I'm okay with in the end. As well, if the funeral, which we saw in the Fleischer Power run, was included in the post-crisis timeline, it will probably take something away from what we see in the second half of this issue. But in any event, the Spectre makes his way to the evidence locker at police headquarters and locates the bones of Jim Corrigan. And we can see that it's not just the Spectre, but it's the Spectre and Corrigan talking together, as he muses that while he's holding his bones in his hands, it's interesting to think that he's been the Spectre far longer than he ever was a flesh and blood human. This is a very surreal experience for him. And it leads to one final argument between Corrigan and the Spectre, as the Spectre still feels no sense of remorse over his actions in Vltava. And Corrigan gets angry with the Spectre and says, still you won't own up to this? We acted of pure anger in Vltava. Our actions were not justified. There's no way that you can justify what we did, Spectre. But the time is passing, and it's an argument which they're going to have to put on hold as they make their way with the bones back to the church. And clearly nobody can sleep that night, as we see Kramer and Nate and Alex there. And Jim apologizes to all three of them. He apologizes to Father Kramer for all of the horrors which he has had to witness during his time as Jim's spiritual advisor. He apologizes to Nate for all of the things that he has said and done that have hurt Nate. And he apologizes to Alex as well. And then we see the Spectre issue an apology. And he apologizes for his actions in Vltava. And he says he now realizes that his actions were unjustified. And so Father Kramer forgives Jim and the Spectre in the name of the Father, the Mother, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So Father Kramer, being an unconventional priest right till the end, Alex forgives Jim, and Nate, who over the course of this series picked up a number of Corrigan's 30s era speech mannerisms, says, you know what, partner, we're square. We're okay. And so there's that nice bit of closure prior to the service, which will happen the next day. And so morning comes, and talk about pathetic fallacy. Pathetic fallacy is a literary term in which the weather reflects the general tone of the story. And it's a rather bleak morning. And we see Father Kramer, Nate, and Alex at the tombstone. We see the Spectre there. And I think it's fitting that we see the Spectre and not Corrigan, because it's like the Spectre is paying his last respects to his current host. And the Spectre asks Father Kramer to wait a moment before starting the service, just so that the Spectre can reflect on the fact that it's fitting that there's such a small crowd in attendance, given how Jim and the Spectre both alienated so many people over the years who would have otherwise attended this event. But then things change. The Phantom Stranger appears, and he says to the Spectre, "How could I miss this, old friend? How could I miss a chance to pay my last respects to Jim Corrigan. Madame Xanadu appears.